What if the chaos you see every day is not random at all? What if global tension, collapsing values, and rising defiance are not signs of the world falling apart, but signals that it is moving towards something specific? What if history is not ending in destruction, but heading toward a moment of authority being claimed? Most people are waiting for collapse, but what if the final act is not chaos? What if it is a throne? Tonight, we are not asking when the world ends. We are asking who rules when it does. Welcome to Hidden Origins. Here, we uncover the deeper patterns beneath history, belief, and power. What you are about to hear challenges the way most people understand the end of the world. For generations, the end of history has been imagined as disorder, systems breaking, nations collapsing, truth dissolving into confusion. But ancient writings present a very different picture. They do not describe history slipping out of control. They describe it moving toward confrontation. Not between nations, not between ideologies, but between authority and resistance. One ancient figure stands at the center of this idea, not as a mystic guessing the future, but as a leader who understood power from the inside. He ruled, fought wars, governed peoples, and yet claimed to see something far beyond his own time. His writings suggest that humanity's greatest crisis would not be technological, economic, or military. It would be a crisis of authority.
The defining question of the final chapter of history is not how will we survive, but who will rule. Across cultures and centuries, one pattern repeats itself. Humanity resists limits. Boundaries are redefined. Authority is questioned. Not only political authority, but moral authority, truth itself. The instinct is always the same. We decide. We define good and evil. We determine right and wrong. No higher voice governs us. This resistance does not emerge in isolation. It organizes, it aligns, it gains momentum. The ancient texts describe a moment when leadership structures, systems, and collective voices converge, not to fight one another, but to reject restraint itself. The language used is not emotional, it is calculated. Leaders confer. Power consolidates. The goal is simple: remove external authority. This is not ignorance, it is defiance. And here is the critical shift. This resistance does not alarm heaven. The writings describe something unsettling. While the world escalates, heaven remains unmoved. No panic, no emergency response, no scramble for control. Instead, there is calm, certainty, authority already established. The reason is simple. The outcome was never in doubt. History is not waiting for a solution. The solution is already positioned. This reframes everything. What appears like moral collapse is actually exposure. What looks like chaos is alignment. The resistance itself becomes evidence that the final stage is approaching. The texts introduce a powerful idea. The end of rebellion is not destruction, it is replacement. Authority does not vanish, it returns. Leadership is not erased, it is revealed. This is why the end is not portrayed as a void, but as a transfer. Power does not disappear, it changes hands. The world does not drift into nothingness, it arrives at accountability.
And here is the most uncomfortable part. The final authority is not described as distant or detached. It is described as legitimate, earned. A ruler who does not dominate by force, but by right. Someone who understands suffering because it was chosen.
someone whose authority is rooted not in conquest, but in sacrifice. That is why resistance intensifies before the end, because opposition always sharpens when legitimacy is undeniable. The world believes it is breaking free, but the pattern suggests it is moving closer. This is not fear-based prophecy. It is structural reality. When systems reject authority, they do not create freedom, they create vacuum, and every vacuum demands to be filled. The ancient writers were not obsessed with endings, they were focused on outcomes, and the outcome they describe is not fire first, it is a throne. In the next part, we will examine how this authority is revealed, why resistance peaks just before exposure, and why history's final movement is not escape, but confrontation. If this perspective is reshaping how you see the world, subscribe to Hidden Origins and stay with us. What comes next explains why the struggle over authority is reaching its breaking point and why it cannot end any other way. When limits disappear, people celebrate freedom, but history shows something else always follows: instability. Boundaries are not merely restrictions, they are structure. Remove structure and power does not vanish, it concentrates. This is why resistance to authority does not create equality, it creates hierarchy. Someone always decides, someone always rules. The question is never whether authority exists, but who holds it. Ancient writers understood this instinctively. They described a world that does not reject control entirely, but rejects external control. Humanity does not want chaos, it wants autonomy, the ability to define itself without accountability. This is why the final conflict is not moral disagreement, it is jurisdictional conflict. Who has the right to rule? The ancient texts describe leaders coming into alignment not accidentally, but intentionally. Systems coordinating, values standardizing, not around worship, but around independence. The goal is not unity for peace, it is unity for control. This is where the idea of resistance becomes global. When people hear rebellion, they imagine riots or disorder, but the writings describe something far more dangerous: order without accountability. Systems that function smoothly while rejecting any higher authority. Efficient, organized, powerful.
This is why the final resistance is subtle. It does not announce itself as defiance, it presents itself as progress. And yet, behind the language of freedom lies the same ancient instinct: we will decide. The writings then introduce a disturbing image. While authority is rejected on earth, authority is already established elsewhere. Not forming, not evolving, already seated. This is where the narrative changes perspective. It moves from human counsels to something higher. And what is revealed is not urgency, but certainty. The authority above is not threatened by resistance below. In fact, resistance confirms timing, because rebellion always surfaces just before exposure. Think of it like this: legitimacy is invisible until challenged. A throne only becomes visible when someone tries to take it. This explains why resistance intensifies as history progresses. It is not because authority is weak, but because it is near. The ancient texts describe a figure who does not rush into confrontation. He waits, positioned, established, allowing resistance to reveal itself fully.
This waiting is not passivity, it is strategy. The authority described is not reactive. It does not scramble to suppress opposition. It allows opposition to assemble, align, and declare itself openly. Why? Because legitimacy requires contrast. Only when defiance is complete can authority be unmistakable. This is why the end is not sudden, it is gradual. Systems form, values shift, lines are drawn. The world is not caught off guard, it participates. And then comes the reveal. The authority that was previously ignored is now undeniable. The same systems that rejected restraint are confronted with the reality of rule, not imposed, but revealed.
This is the most uncomfortable truth in the ancient writings. The end is not about destruction of systems, but exposure of loyalty. Who will submit when authority is no longer theoretical? This is why the final movement is not escape. There is no disappearance of responsibility, no hiding from accountability. The confrontation is direct. The writings describe this authority as both ruler and mediator, power and restraint united, judgment and mercy existing together. Not an authority that delights in control, but one that has the right to it. This distinction matters because the world does not reject authority due to cruelty. It rejects authority due to pride. The refusal to submit is not about injustice, it is about independence. The ancient message is clear. The crisis of the end is not that authority appears, it is that authority was always there and ignored. In the final phase, neutrality disappears. Alignment becomes unavoidable, not because force is applied, but because reality clarifies. This is why the resistance cannot win, not because it is weak, but because it is opposing something that does not need to fight to rule. In Part 3, we will examine what happens when this authority moves from position to action, why opposition collapses not through violence, but through inevitability. If this analysis is helping you see history differently, subscribe to Hidden Origins. What comes next explains why the world's systems cannot stop what is already established and why the final confrontation is closer than most realize.
Up to this point, we have seen a clear pattern. Authority is resisted. Systems align in defiance. Power concentrates under the banner of autonomy. But the ancient texts do not end with resistance. They move toward a moment when waiting turns into action. This is where inevitability replaces tension. The authority that was previously positioned does not rush forward, it advances deliberately. The texts describe a transition from restraint to rule, from silence to declaration. And when that shift happens, resistance does not collapse through force, it collapses through exposure. Because resistance relies on illusion. As long as authority is unseen, defiance feels justified. As long as accountability seems distant, rebellion feels like freedom. But once authority steps into view, the narrative changes instantly. This is why the ancient writers emphasize timing. Action does not begin when resistance appears. It begins when resistance is complete. Only then is the contrast unmistakable. The writings describe authority extending influence from a central source outward, not retreating from opposition, but governing in the midst of it. This detail matters. It reveals that the final movement is not withdrawal, but engagement. Authority does not eliminate opposition by avoiding it. It overcomes opposition, by remaining unchallenged within it. This is a profound reversal of expectation. Most imagine the end as separation, good escaping, evil collapsing, but the ancient framework presents confrontation without chaos. Authority remains steady while resistance destabilizes itself. The systems that rejected restraint begin to fracture under their own weight, not because they are attacked, but because autonomy without accountability cannot sustain itself.
This is why the final exposure feels sudden, even though it was long prepared. The texts describe this authority as uniquely qualified, not simply powerful, but legitimate. The right to rule does not come from conquest alone. It comes from sacrifice, from understanding weakness, from choosing restraint before exercising power. This distinction separates tyranny from sovereignty. Tyranny rules through fear. Sovereignty rules through right. The authority described holds both power and mediation, judgment and mercy, control and invitation. This dual nature explains why resistance persists for so long, because mercy delays judgment. But mercy is not permission. Eventually, the moment arrives when delay no longer serves restoration, when clarity becomes necessary. This is when authority moves from patience to proclamation. And when that happens, resistance loses its coherence. The writings describe opposition crumbling not because it is defeated in battle, but because it is revealed as unsustainable. Truth does not need to destroy lies, it only needs to appear. This is why the final confrontation is described as decisive but brief. The outcome is never in question. The authority was never competing, it was waiting. At this stage, alignment becomes unavoidable. Neutrality dissolves. Every system, every structure, every loyalty is exposed.
This is not about punishment first. It is about recognition. Who truly rules? The ancient writers make a striking claim. The final authority does not need to prove dominance. It simply assumes position. And in doing so, everything else is measured against it. This is the moment when false freedom is revealed as dependency, when self-rule is exposed as illusion, when autonomy collapses under the weight of consequence. The end is not chaos because chaos is already resolved. The final stage is order restored. This is why the texts describe the conclusion as a transfer of authority, not annihilation. Power shifts, claims dissolve, reality asserts itself. And yet, even here, the tone is not triumphant in cruelty. It is solemn, purposeful, final. Because the goal was never destruction, it was alignment. This is the uncomfortable truth woven through the ancient narrative. Resistance was allowed so that allegiance could be chosen. The authority does not coerce loyalty, it reveals reality and allows response. In the final part, we will explore why this moment is not only about judgment, but invitation, why the conclusion of history still contains mercy, and why the final call is not fear, but surrender. If you want to understand how the story truly ends and what choice remains even at the final moment, subscribe to Hidden Origins. The final part reveals why the end is not just inevitable, but meaningful.
Everything leads here. After resistance has exposed itself, after authority has moved from patience to position, one question remains unanswered, not for systems or nations, but for individuals. What happens when authority is no longer theoretical? The ancient texts are precise at this point. They do not end with domination, they end with decision. This is the detail most people miss. The conclusion of history is not described as a moment where humanity is crushed under power. It is described as a moment where allegiance is clarified. The final authority does not demand loyalty through force, it offers recognition before judgment. This is why the ending is not sudden destruction, it is an invitation. Even after resistance reaches its peak, the narrative pauses. The authority that now stands undeniable does something unexpected. It calls for surrender, not annihilation. Not submission through fear, but alignment through trust. This reveals the heart of the entire story. The goal was never to prove power. The goal was to restore order without destroying those willing to return to it. The ancient writers describe this moment using the language of loyalty, an appeal to recognize rightful rule before consequences unfold, a final window where resistance can become reconciliation. Because judgment is real, but it is not impulsive. It arrives only after every opportunity to choose differently has been exhausted. This reframes the end of the world completely. The end is not about fire first, it is about truth first.
When authority stands revealed, excuses disappear. Confusion fades. The illusion of neutrality collapses. Every claim is measured against reality. And this is where modern culture feels the tension most sharply. We live in an age that celebrates self-definition, where authority is seen as oppression and boundaries as threats, where submission is framed as weakness and obedience as loss of identity. But the ancient narrative says the opposite. True freedom does not come from rejecting authority. It comes from aligning with the right one. This is why the crisis of the end is not external collapse, it is internal refusal, the unwillingness to bow even when reality is clear. The final judgment, then, is not arbitrary, it is consequential. It is not about punishment being imposed, it is about outcomes being finalized. Those who reject authority are not destroyed for rejecting it. They are left with the consequences of ruling themselves. And those who align are not rewarded for compliance, they are restored to proper order. This is the meaning behind the final invitation, the call to choose allegiance while choice still exists. The ancient writers are clear. Mercy is extended to the very end, not because authority is uncertain, but because it is just. Only when mercy is refused does judgment become necessary. This is why the end is not tragic, it is resolved. History does not spiral into meaninglessness, it arrives at clarity. Every rebellion sharpens contrast, every rejection exposes truth, every act of defiance brings the final moment closer. Not because authority is losing control, but because authority is allowing humanity to reveal its heart. The end, then, is not chaos, it is coronation, not of a new ruler, but of the one who was always rightful.
This is why the ancient writers describe the final scene not as panic, but as permanence. Authority established, order restored, reality aligned. And standing before that reality, every individual faces the same question that defined the entire story. Who will you trust to rule? The end of the world is not the failure of a plan, it is the fulfillment of one. Not the collapse of meaning, but its confirmation. History bends toward this moment not by accident, but by design. And even now, before authority is fully revealed,
the invitation still stands. Choose alignment over resistance. Choose truth over autonomy. Choose allegiance before consequence. Because when authority no longer waits, choice will no longer exist. If this series changed how you see history, power, and the future, subscribe to Hidden Origins. We don't chase fear, we uncover truth. And remember this, the world is not falling apart, it is being drawn together, not toward chaos, but toward a throne.